Awesome. Yeah, I'm so excited for this session. And I follow both of you very intently on LinkedIn. And so seeing everything that y'all do is always so exciting. So, well,
that means a lot.
Absolutely, especially with you in forests. So
exactly.
Grace Ann, I'm a little disappointed. Are you not near any parts of nature where you can be walking about?
It's a great question, actually. My husband and I just moved into a house and the backyard is quite wild right now. It's not as wild as Liam's forests, but it's sort of wild still. But yeah, I haven't done any recorded videos out in the trees yet.
I love it. It's a great pattern disruptor. So I'm all for it. But well, hey, everyone.
This is exactly what his goal was too.
Yeah. You're like, what is one thing? So you've got Tim cutting fruit. You have you in a little walkabout of self
we
journey.
Were just talking about this morning.
We literally just had this conversation. Me and Tim were just talking too about.
I was chatting with Tim yesterday about this.
That's amazing. Well, that's perfect then.
But B2B marketing is way too small.
It is that's for sure. But well, hey everyone, as folks are starting to trickle in here, I know it's a little early in the morning over on the West Coast. I'm hanging out in San Francisco or San Jose today, so I'm not used to the time difference. It's really throwing me off. But we are so excited that y'all are here. I just dropped a question in the chat. I want to hear if you guys think that the next session should be in the forest with Liam and Grace Ann. Let us know, because I'm putting some money that most of you would probably say yes, but would love to hear John, Cammie, what you guys have to say about this. Steph, what about you? And as we're waiting for a few more folks to trickle in here, I want to hear. So Liam, you're in the forest, but where exactly are you?
I am about an hour outside of New York City. So I am in Putnam County. I'm like right as you like just get past commuting distance to New York City, where it starts to like, it's less suburbs and more horse farms. I'm like right in that spot.
I love that. And Gracie, are you by any horse farms?
Yeah, actually. So I'm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And if anyone's familiar with the area, there's quite a few horse farms up in New Hope, which is about 20 minutes above where I live. So awesome. There's a few. Yeah.
So you are in like true Amish country out there then too.
Yes. Yeah. It's it's about an hour-ish south of New York City, and about 45 minutes from Philadelphia. So
I love it. That's awesome. Well, excuse me, I'll have to send you guys pictures of my horse. So he doesn't pull carts and buggies like the Amish folk horses do, but he's, I think, just as impressive. Well, okay, as we are getting started here, as always, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. So if you're new, would love to hear where you're coming from. Please drop that in the chat. Make sure it's turned to everyone, not just panelists or hosts. I'm always guilty of that. And then also, if you've got any questions during the conversation, please make sure you've got 3 opportunities to ask them. One, you can drop them in the chat. The second is you can drop them in the Q&A box. You can also make that anonymous if you'd like. Or the third, which has been the most popular lately, is just DMing me in the community. So always here to ask those questions. Please make sure that you're asking them, because we really want to make this as impactful as possible for y'all as well. So as we get started here, I'll pass this over to Liam and Grace Ann, and we'll just kind of kick things off.
Awesome. All right, let's get started. Well, firstly, again, thank you to Katie and the Metadata team for having us here today. Thank you for everyone who's joining and who's registered to this and maybe listening to the recording. Jump into it. My screen just froze, actually. I don't know if I froze for all of you, but my screen just froze.
You did, but it's okay.
Okay. Hopefully I'm back now. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get into it. As Katie mentioned, if anyone's got questions, we'll try to answer as we go, as we can. We'll try to answer some questions at the end as well. But if you do have any follow-up questions, you can always reach out to either Liam or myself or Katie through the demand Slack or directly on LinkedIn.
All right. And for anyone who doesn't know us, just to get started, if you haven't seen us inexplicably making videos in woods and forests for whatever reason, my name is Liam. This is Grace Ann. We are co-founders of a demand generation agency called Storybook Marketing. more importantly, we came from a career of being in-house marketing leaders. So demand generation has been the role that we have played in-house. We have built teams, we have run teams, we have come in and we've seen just about everything that you can possibly imagine. And all of that perspective is really going to go into what we want to go through today. And so just to give you kind of a bit of kind of an overview. Oh, and sorry about that. Went back. Bear with me. There we go. So in today's presentation, it's not intended to be sort of fluffy and philosophical. Really, where we want to focus this presentation is on actionable things that you can actually take into your program right now to try and see an impact. And the perspective that we've really been taking on this is we don't need to tell anybody that this is a difficult environment to be doing marketing and to be doing sales. It is not easy to come by opportunity. And so all of the things that we're going through really are taking that into consideration. It's making sure that you can get the most out of the program that you have. And we know that right now, there's never been a more important time to have like a program that is as efficiently running as possible. So that's the entire perspective that we're taking. And so it's going to be about 45 minutes. We're going to go through a lot of different areas. If anything is sort of like really in-depth and requires, there's going to be a recording, and you can always reach out to us afterwards if there's anything that we can expand on and try and just add more detail.
So we mentioned looking at your program through a new lens. Just to start things off, we're going to go through a bit of the lens through which Liam and I have typically looked at demand gen programs. And we like to use this analogy of on-ramps and off-ramps. And we're going to explain more about what that means here. So we see on-ramps as the social and distribution channels where your audience spends their time, as well as the content and messaging that you're putting in front of them across those channels. So this is very often what people tend to think of when they think of demand gen. But the distinction here is important because this is really just how people find out about or learn about your brand. And too often what we see is teams trying to use these on-ramps as conversion points, which can often lead to a lack of results. That said, your off-ramps are your conversion points. So this is how your audience enters into a sales conversation. And they're going to vary from company to company, but they're frequently some combination of these four. So inbound demo requests, events, outbound efforts led by SDR, BDR teams, and then if you have a PLG model, like free trials. One of the most important things here is that buyers are always going to take the path that they prefer. They're always going to prioritize convenience and take the path to conversion that's most convenient for them. And the goal isn't to try and fight that, but to embrace it and make it easier for them to convert across those paths. And we're going to get more into what all of this sort of means and how it rolls out in practice later on in this presentation. But now, sort of with an understanding of this on-ramps, off-ramps analogy, what we'd first encourage you to do when looking at your own program, ask yourself, are you using the right on-ramps, so the right channels and the right content across those channels for the audience that you're trying to reach? And do you know what your off-ramps are? And then secondly, are you potentially trying to force a conversion on something that should really be used as an on-ramp? Because if so, that's potentially budget that could be better used elsewhere. And again, the whole focus of today's presentation is how you can get more out of the program you have. So those are going to be the first places that we're going to start to look.
And we really want to labor this point because it is a really important one. If there's one thing that we've seen time and time again in programs, it's friction is one of the most inefficient things you can have in a program. The more you are trying to push your audience down a pathway they don't normally go, trying to get them to convert on a channel that they just want to consume content on rather than engage in a sales conversation on. It's about understanding where are you reaching them and where do they naturally come into a sales conversation. And like Gia mentioned, it differs across programs, but it's about really just understanding what is the natural way people find their way to you and where is the places that they spend time. And as simple as that sounds, that's demand gen in a nutshell. It's about reaching the audience where they are, engaging with them, and then having it as easy as possible for them to find their way to you. It's about minimizing friction as much as possible. And so where we wanted to start on this, with all of this in mind, is really just taking a look at through the lens of the budget first and foremost. The first place to look really is understanding, in order to get better performance out of your program, it's good to look at how you're actually allocating your budget, and are you doing it in the correct way, driving towards the right goals. And so we're going to do kind of like a semi-typical but fictional example here, which is if we look at a typical demand generation budget, and yours is going to look different, but ones we've seen typically is you may have a breakdown of your program spend. And let's say in this case, you've got 40% of it is being spent on LinkedIn, driving towards your audience. 40% of it is some third-party content syndication, promoting content, and maybe 20% of it is paid search, where you're driving people in off things like Google and Bing. If you look at that from a snapshot, and that's pretty typical. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that setup. It's very common. Another way, just to add another layer on top of it, is within those buckets, what ways are you using that budget on those particular channels? So to dive a little bit deeper, if you look in the example here, the blue slice, which is, let's say, LinkedIn. So 40% of your LinkedIn spend is on LinkedIn. And of that spend, the dark blue is demo requests. So maybe you're pushing people towards incentivized demos or ads, or people like requesting to talk to sales, some version of a really low funnel conversion. And then the rest of it is content lead gen, where you're pushing people through gated forms, downloading white papers, very typical setup. And paid search might be the inverse of that, where maybe the majority of it is keywords that are demo request related, and then some of it is towards content. And then syndicated content is all purely a lead gen play. First and foremost, it's important to just take a snapshot of your program, because it helps get a sense of what is it that we're actually trying to accomplish, and is our budget allocated in a way that actually drives towards that. And let's say your main KPI is just leads and MQLs. If so, great, that's wonderful. If the goal is accomplishing that, amazing. But let's say more reasonably and probably more realistically, you're being pushed to generate qualified pipeline. The question then becomes, how well are these channels that your spend is allocated amongst actually accomplishing that? Because if it's not succeeding in doing this, there's a good chance that if you're spending money, but you're not seeing those pipeline results coming out on the other side, something in the middle is going wrong. And that could be, and we're going to get into these, you might be potentially misusing that channel. Maybe the way and the types of offers that you're promoting through those channels aren't actually the kinds of outcomes that the audience is more likely to engage with, or maybe the channels are generating what look like great results, but they don't materialize down the funnel. So really, it's about trying to kind of understand, are we using this channel that is actually an on-ramp to reach the audience as an off-ramp to try and convert them? And maybe we're putting the right and wrong things in front of them. We're going to go into these in depth, but really we're trying to just understand, first and foremost, how is our budget allocated and what are we trying to accomplish from it?
I think that's a great segue into diving deeper into those off-ramps now. So we'll start with lead gen, and we're not here to demonize lead gen. I think there's been a lot of that lately. And as much as we would all probably love to turn off lead gen efforts and a perfect state demand gen program, we know that that's much easier said than done. It's still a major part of a lot of teams' programs. And so it's worth taking a second to stop and think about, what are your goals for lead gen? And we're not here to say, stop lead gen, turn lead gen off. It's more, how can we do lead gen better? How can we do it more effectively? And you have to take that second to stop and think about, really, what are your goals for your lead gen efforts in order to understand if it's really working in doing that? And there's really two main goals that it could be: meetings and pipeline generation, or database building. So you're either looking to create meetings and pipeline from the leads you're converting off the back of things like form fills, or you're looking to build out a database of leads that will turn into pipeline down the line through engagement with different pieces of marketing content. But it's really important to be clear on what your near-term goals for your lead gen efforts are, because it's going to help you evaluate how effectively you're accomplishing them and where there might be opportunities to then get more out of certain pieces.
And for what it's worth, just to really echo what Gia said, there's a lot of LinkedIn rhetoric about ungate everything. I've been guilty of saying lots of it myself, but I think the truth is, in almost every program we've ever analyzed or worked on, lead gen plays a role. And I think it's important to just be honest about what the intentions of that lead gen are, because it is a very big part of programs. And what we do often see is that people will say, oh yeah, we generate leads because we want to nurture them. But the truth is, you may be trying to get them to an SDR team as quickly as possible, or you might be actually sincerely trying to build a long-term database. But it's good to just sanity check, what is your goal? Because whatever your near-term goal is, and we specify near-term, whatever that goal is, that's going to help you analyze, is it actually accomplishing that goal? And we'll show you some examples in a second. So let's take the first example, the lead generation for the explicit intention of trying to generate meetings in pipeline. And this is a very reasonable part. We may not like lots of the ways that it gets done, but it is a lot of programs where you promoting an ebook, whether or not you've got some nurturing or scoring in place, those leads are relatively quickly going to find their way to your SDR, BDR team, and they're going to try and follow up on them. The goal is obviously to try and get as many of those people to convert as possible. And so this one's pretty binary. The question becomes, is it actually accomplishing that? And what we often see is that marketing measurement tends to stop a little bit too early, where we're looking at it from, okay, so we're using all of these different channels to create these leads, and some of them are MQLs. What's our cost per MQL? And you get that picture of, look how effectively I've lowered my cost per lead with these different channels. But really what you want to be looking at is what's in those orange buckets. It's how effectively are those leads finding their way through to those end conversion points? Are they generating meetings? And are those meetings converting into ops? And when you complete that picture, it gives you what is often a much bleaker reality than you might be expecting, but it's also the real reality of how well it's actually doing the job you're hoping it does.
And the point that I would reiterate here is, this is if your goal with those lead gen efforts is meetings and pipeline. If your goal is generating leads for the purposes of building up your marketable database, we're going to get into that here in the next couple of slides, but that's where measuring the effectiveness of that based on meetings and ops outcomes may be a little bit disingenuous. And so it really does matter that you have clarity on what your goal and what your intention with those efforts are and how you measure it.
Sorry. So if we can go back real quick. One of the questions that I just got in Slack, so thank you for that, is this something that, this is a first-time manager, is this something that you would feel comfortable presenting to your VP of marketing to kind of show where numbers are at, and you can show like the change over month, quarter over quarter, year over year through additional columns? Is that something y'all would recommend for a first-time manager? I'm
curious your thoughts, Gia. I definitely would. I think there was someone posted this on LinkedIn yesterday, and I agreed vehemently with it. One of the best ways to get seen as a strategic leader and start to actually come up is when you're looking at things from a more holistic point of view, and not just from, hey, I hit my metrics, so I did my job. It can be scary to essentially go in and go, hey, we got all these leads and they looked great, but they went nowhere. That's a hard story to tell. But I think as long as you set it up with what your perspective is, I'm not only interested in showing a lead goal. I want to make sure these leads actually materialize into something. So we're going to take a much more stringent view. That's kind of a full picture. Where you have to be careful is what the time lag is for that to happen, because you can generate leads today that may take 2 weeks, 3 months, however long. I think the more you understand that kind of journey, the better. But I would certainly recommend it. But I'm curious your thoughts, Jay.
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
So an example of this would be what you see here. This again, fictional example, but this is based on what I've seen and Gia has seen and we've done when we were in-house, where once you start to complete the picture, and these metrics will look different for different groups, teams, and depending, but for this argument's sake, what you can see is, let's say you were spending $40,000 on LinkedIn and you generated $25,000 of pipeline. Now, obviously that hasn't closed. Ideally, that would be revenue, but already you can start to paint a picture of once you're looking at it through the outcomes, it's pretty obvious where you're starting to see efficiencies, where you're not, because often the leads can look great, but when the outcomes start to feed back in, and I've seen this happen where we ran a campaign like that, spent tens of thousands of dollars, generated all these great looking leads. And then when we looked back at the end of the quarter, we either broke even at best or lost money at worst when you looked at how much revenue came from them. And we say that through the lens of, this is only applicable if that's explicitly what you were trying to accomplish. If the goal was we generate leads and hopefully we'll nurture them and they'll engage with content and all, that's a great angle. This is purely if the main reason you generated those leads was to feed an SDR team. It's very binary. It either generated the outcome or it didn't. And did you do it in a profitable way? And this paints what can often be a pretty sobering picture. And like you'll see the example here, the syndicated content line where they generated no pipeline. We have seen this, and we would very much caution against this, that there's lots of third-party vendors that can promise extremely low costs per lead. You generate all these amazing CMO titles and they come in, and then ultimately nothing comes to them because it was a little bit sort of over-promised, if you will.
Yeah.
I think you'd add on it, yeah.
Yeah, and so the next question is sort of like, what do you do with this? And if you're looking at your reporting and you're seeing potentially a similar picture, where we would look first then in the channels that didn't generate the outcomes that you were hoping they would, evaluate the channel itself first and validate the fact that your audience that you're trying to reach is actually on that channel, because not every single audience is on every single channel. We work with a number of clients whose main target audience isn't really on LinkedIn. And so that's going to be the first place that we would suggest starting, and validate that. And that you're not trying to use, like we've said before, what is probably best used as an on-ramp as an off-ramp, and trying to force a conversion there that shouldn't really be happening. If all that checks out, your audience is on that channel, you're using the channel correctly, then it's likely the content that you were serving your audience wasn't correct. Maybe it's just not hitting the mark. It's not the right message. Maybe they're familiar with who your brand is, but they just don't quite understand what it is you do. And maybe you weren't going in depth enough about that in that content. Maybe they've got a great understanding of what you do, but they don't understand why you're better than the other guy. So maybe your content needs to speak more to that. So that's sort of the cadence of the way that we would look at, how to get more out of these channels and start to turn that performance around.
So doing it from a different lens, let's say the goal for the leads that you're generating was not explicitly immediate pipeline, but you were trying to build a really strong database. This is a great strategy, having a strong database who's engaging with content. We've seen this be massive producers long-term of people who are constantly in your database. You can call on for webinar attendees, exactly like the email that Katie sent out today. Like that's a great part of a lead gen strategy. This is a different view, and there's something that what we've ultimately not seen too many people talk about here is really, if this is the goal, then the way you vet it is not just how good were the names of the people that we generated the leads from, but how good was the engagement that came afterwards. And what we really mean by that is, ultimately, if your goal is to build a database of leads, what you really want to make sure that they're doing is actually engaging beyond that first moment they came into the database. So give you an example here. If you were to look at, again, same breakdown of those numbers, but if your goal was to try and accrue as many good quality leads at face value, let's look at the first two columns here, where you look at the number of leads you got from the spend. And in this case, LinkedIn, 250 leads for $40,000, $160 cost per lead. Pretty expensive, pretty common. It's what you often see with those channels. When you look down at some of the other channels, like let's say syndicated content, you can find there's lots of vendors who'll say, hey, we'll get you really cheap leads. Your cost per lead is going to be really low. So you ran an experiment and you got 441 leads at a $79 cost per lead. Sounds amazing at face value. And the names of those are probably great. They're all C-suite titles of massive Fortune 500 companies, and everything looks great on paper. One thing we found extremely valuable to do is look at how engaged those leads are. There's a number of ways you can do this. The easiest way you can do this is just run a report from your database of all the leads you generated. How many of them opened even one additional email beyond the one they came into in the database. Like literally even just one, you'd be surprised at how that changes the picture. What you're really trying to get a picture of is, it's not how much did it cost to get the lead, but how much did it cost to get a lead who is engaged with future content? Because that's where the value of those leads really comes in. And what you can find is that changes the picture dramatically. So like in this case, again, these are fictional numbers, but we've seen this materialize in real data where suddenly, if you look at it from a quote unquote engaged lead, and you can define that any number of ways, but even whatever way you do, you can suddenly find that what was a very expensive lead, like the LinkedIn one at $160, ends up being much, much cheaper than the low quality ones that were very cheap initial leads to get in the door, because that's really what it comes down to. It's also, and again, from like a new manager point of view, these can be scary stories to try and come in. The way that we've certainly found them, it can feel terrifying to go, hey, we picked a vendor who promised us an $80 cost per lead, but when we added an engagement layer, it turns out they were trash. Like that's a terrible story to try and tell. You don't want to look like you've completely failed. But as long as you set it up that, hey, we're going to look and try and get the lowest cost per lead, but we're going to check and validate this as an experiment. Let's see what the real engaged quality is. And if it's not great, then we'll reevaluate. Ultimately, what we want is real, active, engaged people who are going to consume our content. Framing it in ways like that can make it a much easier conversation to try and have.
Yep.
I think you're down on that, yeah.
No, just that, sort of the takeaway here being that if you are starting to see outcomes like this, where the cost of a lead is much higher when you add an engagement layer on, start reallocating that budget if you're able to. Maybe start to allocate more towards where the cost per lead with an engagement layer is more efficient.
And I saw the comment about the fictionalized syndicated. Yes, I completely agree. By any modern standards, that is cheap. I have paid $80 a lead for what were like McDonald's CMOs at one point in time, and it was absolutely terrible. Like it was a non-starter. I know I'm getting on a soapbox about syndicated content leads, but there are a lot of people promising amazing things and not delivering out there.
All right, let's talk retargeting, the unsung hero of paid media. So we all know that shifting off lead gen, as we said, shifting off it completely is very hard. But one of the best ways that you can start to evolve your program and make those lead gen efforts more effective is by doing retargeting. So what we mean by this is, firstly, when you think about the journey your audience is going through with a typical lead gen strategy, about 90% of the people that you're paying to drive to your landing page or site won't convert. They won't fill out that form, which means you're leaving a lot on the table of traffic that you've paid for. And this is what makes traditional lead gen really inefficient. So you're paying to drive clicks with this whole audience, but you're only capturing a tiny percentage of them, which is where retargeting comes in.
So a way of thinking about this is not to change the entire structure, because like I said, that's a gargantuan effort in itself. It's how do you add retargeting to get more efficiency out of what you're already generating? And so the idea here is to start to shift towards consumption over conversion. So on the left, you've still got that traditional flow that you typically see where you're running your paid ads, you're getting your gated content, those people are converting. But of that 90+% who are not, they're a prime candidate to build a retargeting list from, so that you can continue to nurture them through things like LinkedIn or whatever channel that you're using to actually get that paid media through, so that you basically are trying to convert them at a later date. It's effectively using your paid media retargeting in the same way you would use a nurturing program inside your database. The only difference here is that rather than waiting for them to convert and be in the database to be able to send an email to, you're continuing to serve them more content that's about consuming things with the explicit intention that they will then convert. So you're essentially converting those right away who will convert, retargeting those who didn't convert on that page, and then all of those after that, then you get more chances to bring them back and try and get them to convert them again. So this, again, all you're doing is trying to squeeze more out of the money you were already paying, because you've paid for those clicks, you've paid for those people to click on the ads. the retargeting cost to try and convert them later on only makes that effort more efficient when you move them down.
And speaking of conversions, we're going to get into our off ramps now. And these are your true conversion points. So if you don't already, it's very important to know where meetings and opportunities come from across your organization, not just your traditional quote unquote marketing sources, but where all meetings and opportunities come from today, because these are going to be your off ramps. And first and foremost, what we always suggest is don't try and change this split. And here's why, because most marketing teams, if inbound is not their number one source, I think the gut instinct, sort of the gut reaction, is to try to pour a lot of resources into making inbound your number one source of meetings and pipeline, because that's typically what success looks like for a marketing team. But the reality is, like, so firstly, in the long run, that's true, but it's a very long-term view. It's not something that happens overnight, because it's a byproduct of where you are as a business on that awareness curve. If you're still early on in that awareness curve and trying to build that awareness with your audience, that's not going to change overnight. And you can end up pouring a lot of resources into something that's not going to generate many near-term results. So for now, if you're looking to get more out of your program right now, what we would suggest is investing demand gen resources into optimizing the output of your number one and number two best meeting and opportunity generating channels, which all comes down to how you increase efficiencies in those channels. So using this example here of a typical week over week report, let's say your number one conversion point channel is outbound. So then what can you do from a demand gen perspective as a demand gen, so let's say manager or leader, what can you do to get more out of that? You can support with content. You can ensure that the messaging that those teams are utilizing is really hitting the right marks with your audience. You can look at where your processes could be more efficient. What does that handoff process look like? How is the prospecting process working? Is everything running as efficiently as it can be? Tools like Chili Piper are really great for optimizing scheduling efficiency. Gifting strategies would be something to potentially look into if that's something that would resonate with your audience and increase conversions there. Is your personalization process scalable? I know personalization is a really sometimes scary thing for teams to tackle. I think it's similar to lead gen and getting off lead gen, is that everybody wants to do it, but the reality is really hard. And you can easily suck a lot of time into personalizing outbound emails. But are there ways to add efficiencies into how you're doing personalization across that outbound channel? Is there an opportunity for an ABM play? Advertising also is another potential lever here. Advertising should ideally make outbound more productive, because you're getting awareness out there ahead of SDR teams reaching out. You're starting to familiarize your audience with your brand, and advertising doesn't just have to look like paid LinkedIn. It can be community advertising. It can be podcast advertising. Again, it all comes down to wherever your audience is.
And something GA said is worth really just reiterating. What a lot of demand gen teams do, and I've made this mistake countless times myself, was you look at the world through the marketing channels lens, and that's all you do. And so you judge success on, well, are we generating marketing influence revenue? And you're gold on that. So it usually makes sense. The SDR team sometimes sits on marketing, sometimes it doesn't. It varies company to company. But especially trying to get seen as a strategic leader, it's always really helpful to be part of the conversation, to say, this is where pipeline comes from for our company. And it depends on the stage of that company quite significantly. Like, again, going back to, like, there was a lot of rhetoric being talked about that inbound is the end result of demand gen. And it can be, but it's a very long-term one, because inbound is the result of really strong brand awareness. It's people who really genuinely know who you are. They understand what you do, and they're coming to you because of that. But if you're in an early stage startup, that's a long ways away. That's an expensive effort that takes quite a long time. And what you often see is, in the earlier stages, outbound and partnerships very often skew really, really heavily, because that's how you're generating a lot of that early pipeline before you've got strong awareness in the market. And as that starts to shift over time, the mix can shift. But knowing where it comes from today helps point you in the direction of how do we impact that? Because if it did turn out that it was outbound, or if it did turn out that it was partnerships, you're much better able to try and increase the efficacy of that than to try and create a totally new channel. Like if you set yourself the goal to say, we're going to bring in all of this pipeline off the back of inbound, that's a very long-term goal, versus if outbound is what works right now, you can help outbound quite dramatically by doing all those things that GA just said. And it's a big shift, but it's one of those shifts that it's how demand gen should make all channels work better, ideally, because more people have heard of you, more people are consuming your content, and therefore more people will respond to your emails, they will attend your events, they will all of the different channels in there.
So one of the questions we got, it's a little bit of a non sequitur, and I know it can lead to a huge discussion, so we don't need to take too much time. But as we're looking at the different types of sources, what are we doing to track the sources? And what does that attribution look like? I said the A word.
Yeah, you did. Okay. Pandora's box.
I know.
The reason that we take that on-ramps, off-ramps mentality is to try and simplify a lot of that attribution, because the attribution can be a really tricky thing. Like what was the reason that they came in? What we're more interested in is what is the pathway that they came in through, because that's really just the way they enter into a conversation, not necessarily the thing that influenced them to do it. Perfect example of this is GA's seen this countless times where, you know, a BDR team or an SDR team could be doing lots of outbounding to a prospect, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a demo request shows up from the people that they've been prospecting for the last few weeks. It's pretty obvious what happened, but like the pathway they took was the one that was more convenient for them. So it's more about what ways do people come in, as opposed to give all of the credit to it. That's where I think attribution becomes that really sticky place, where attribution can be about credit, and credit diverts resources. So if you said, hey, our events are generating all of our pipeline, yeah, but what did you talk about to that audience before they showed up to that event? Like attribution can be a double-edged sword. I think it's easy to start with just how did they get into you? And then how do you make sure that, like, if that's the lowest friction entry point for them, it's more about reach them with the other channels so that they can inbound through those channels that they convert on, if that makes sense. What would you add on that, GA?
No, I wouldn't add anything.
Because she knows it's Pandora's box.
Yeah, she's smarter than me to answer the question.
But sort of moving on to the next slide here, the building on additional ways to increase efficiency within your funnel, particularly with inbounds and how inbounds are being handled. It's probably the number one area of opportunity we often see where there is opportunity to increase efficiency. There's very often leakage in sort of the handoff process and the way that this funnel is handled across the team. So some of the questions that we would ask, or where we would suggest starting to look into things, is what percentage of demo requests convert into meetings? What percentage of those demo requests never replied to your follow-up comms? If you have a PLG model, how are you engaging with free trials? Are you engaging enough? Are you providing them with enough content and support to convert, or upgrade to a paid plan? Are there expired free trials that you could go back out to and re-engage with? Those are some of the places that we would suggest starting in terms of, as we said, optimizing the efficiency of your funnel, making sure you're squeezing. I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say the analogy we're all thinking of, but just squeezing as much as you can out of what you are already getting. And then also thinking about the efficiency of your demo request page. As Liam was just saying, making conversion easy. Your buyers are always going to choose the path that's most convenient for them. So make them all easy and seamless to convert on. So when it comes to the efficiency of your demo request page, firstly, make it easy to find within your site, and then make it easy to convert. So tools, that can automate that, and certain pieces of that process are great. Unbounce is great for very easy plug and play of landing page design. Chili Piper, as I've mentioned, great tool for streamlining your scheduling processes on both inbound and outbound. Things like Clearbit are great for enriching data so that buyers have less fields to fill out. Outreach, sales off, great tools for automating that sequencing, of course, so that you're following up with the submissions in a timely manner. And I know a lot of these probably sound obvious, but it's all those little things that sort of accumulate, and just mastering the little things and making sure you're not leaving anything on the table, it starts to add up.
And that bullet point at the top, like, we can't stress that enough. The things that are on here are often the most impactful things that you can adjust within a program. In the same way, this is GA's analogy, so I'm stealing it, but in the same way that product teams end up with tech debt, you end up with a lot of kind of operational process debt on the marketing and sales side. You would be shocked at how often we come in and find gaping holes of opportunity within programs here. And it's not because anyone dropped the ball. It's just that everything moves so fast. People rarely stop to look back and go, hey, of all the demo requests that we got in the last month, how many of them actually attended the demo? Because those are such high intent people. Where did we drop the ball? Was it that it took us too long to respond from the SDR side? Can that be tightened up? Was it that there was too much back and forth in the conversation with the SDR team and they couldn't align on a time and they ended up getting cold? Was it that they booked too far out and the time was there and they didn't get them to show up? Like, you spot, once you track it from, I mean, you can get really meticulous on this, but go from, okay, here's the page visit to the page conversion to the number of outreaches to the how many of them got engaged from the SDR to how many of them actually got a response from the SDR to how many of them show. Like, once you start to track it, you'll very often go, wow, we're like really missing this spot. And those are people who are explicitly saying we would like to talk to you. So like, closing that gap is immediate potential revenue, because that's all people who were high intent, low funnel people ready to have a conversation. And there's so many things you can move within there. And like Jay said, that they're everything from just, are there tools you can bring into place that remove that friction entirely? Are there just ways that you can bring SLAs internally where you've just got an agreement that we have to respond more quickly to these people? I think I remember seeing there was a Chili Piper stat, I think, about like once the drop off to conversions from demo requests, like it used to be like 24 hours response time. Like, now it's expected like 15-minute response time. Like, for every hour that goes by, like, you have material drop off in those. So tightening this place is extremely beneficial. I know I'm massively laboring the point, but it is genuinely where we see opportunity all the time.
Yeah. And just moving on to some of those other sources of meetings and pipeline and thinking about where you could increase efficiency across those. So when you think about events, whether virtual or in person, the questions that I would suggest asking are, could you be activating more pre-event? Could you be engaging with either a list of attendees or across target lists or promoting to your database? Could you be doing more pre-event to start to warm your audience up and familiarize your audience with your brand, and start to recognize your brand when they're at the show, or, potentially set up meetings if it's an in-person event, for while they're at the event. Following events, how timely are you following up? How personalized are you making those follow-ups? So, for example, incorporating notes from the show, if you do have the ability to capture that information from whoever attends, and working those notes into your follow-up to sort of make it easy to keep that conversation going. And then from an outbound standpoint, I've already talked about these a bit, so I won't go into too much more detail on these, but these are really the 4 areas where we commonly see the opportunities to really increase efficiency in your outbound processes. And not all of them require buying new tools. A lot of it is just process and really working smarter, not harder.
All right, let's bring it all back, because we went through a lot of different things in there. Just a quick reminder, and again, obviously the recording will be sent out, but really the way to think through this is, firstly, it helps, and it's very much helped us to just think of it in terms of on-ramps and off-ramps. Are you trying to reach the audience, or are you trying to convert the audience? Do they convert on that channel, or are they more about reaching them? And that simple split helps to really just paint the picture of, what are we trying to accomplish? And is this channel actually designed to accomplish that goal? Simple as it is, it makes such a difference. And then look at that as well through the lens of, well, how are we spending our money? Where is it going? And to what specific goals? And then use that really as just a framework of, again, is our money that we're spending driving towards the actual goals that we're trying to do? And then through the lens of what is reasonably going to be most of the programs is, if you're generating leads, again, same idea. What is the purpose of those leads? Is it near-term pipeline generation, or is it long-term audience building and engagement? And again, that helps you to be able to apply a pretty good way of saying, well, are the leads we're generating the kind of leads that we want, that are having the kinds of outcomes, whether that's meetings or whether that's engagement? Are they the kinds of leads that we actually should be doing? And it helps just to start to narrow down, are the channels we're spending money on actually doing the job that we need them to do? Because there's often very obvious and sometimes very depressing answers of, wow, that channel looked great, but when you really followed it through to the end, it wasn't where we should have been spending our money, or the way we were treating that channel wasn't the way it was designed to be used. And then once you get that perspective, it's about then looking on the other side of the journey, which is, how are they getting into your sales process? Are they the same channels? Are they completely different sources? And are there ways that we can use the channels that we have to impact those sources? Very often they're not coming in the way that they're not coming out the way that they're coming in. And the better you have a perspective of that, the more you can do. And as unsexy as it sounds, the efficiency and tightening up the internal processes is very, very often where there is the most pipeline being left. It's that you spent so much effort getting leads that you never had time to stop and go, well, did they all find their way through that funnel as efficiently as possible? Because that, we all move extremely fast. God knows now more than ever, we wear more hats than we ever have done. And it can be really hard to just get the time to look at those programs. But once a quarter even gives you a snapshot of, look, how leaky is this bucket? And is that, because often that can be a better place to spend your time, especially if you're developing OKRs. Maybe that's where you should be tweaking things rather than find new and more leads, because that's harder and harder and harder. Make your internal process work as efficiently as it possibly can. Anything you'd add on that, Gia?
No, thought that was perfect. Well said. We kicked off with it a bit, but if you weren't able to join us live, if you're just watching this as a recording, if you've got follow-up questions, you can always find either of us in the demand community or reach out to us on LinkedIn as well.
Wow, this was absolutely amazing. Thank you all so much for being here and for the great questions that everyone provided, and Gersan and Liam. I mean, this was awesome. I learned so much, and I love your analogies at the ramps. I think that's amazing. I took some screenshots, so I know I'm going to be looking back on it, but yeah, this was absolutely amazing. And like they said, if you've got any questions, feel free to Slack them in the community. I'll post the recording. I am traveling, so it'll probably be a little bit like a day. Not a big deal, but yeah, we're so excited. This was amazing. Thank you both so much. This was awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one. Bye, all.
Bye-bye.